the morning they buried her father. Her husband pressed divorce papers into her hands before the pastor had finished his opening prayer. She felt the cold of the folded documents before she understood what they were. Before she registered Gavin's breath at her ear, low and certain, saying, "Don't make a scene," and at his shoulder, standing close enough to belong, dressed in careful black, was the woman who had been quietly dismantling Ada's life for the better part of a year. Around that woman's neck hung a small gold brooch shaped like a bird in flight. Ada had last seen it in her jewelry box 3 months ago. She had searched every drawer of that house. She had blamed herself for losing it. She had grieved it quietly, the way you grieve small things that carry enormous weight, because it had belonged to her mother, and her mother was long gone, and objects are all that remain. Now she knew exactly where it had gone, and who had taken it, and who had worn it to her father's funeral as if it were simply an accessory. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. To understand the woman sitting still in that church with divorce papers in her lap, you have to go back before the boardroom, before the funeral, before the brooch, back to a small house at the edge of a small town and a kitchen table, and a father who counted dollars in 4 careful piles every Sunday night. Her name was Ada Bright, and she had grown up with very little money and more love than most people receive in a lifetime. Cornelius Bright was not always the man half the city came to bury that Thursday morning. Long before his name was carved into the lobbies of office buildings, he woke before sunrise to drive a delivery truck. He came home after dark smelling of gasoline and effort. On Sunday evenings he sat at the kitchen table and counted every dollar with the same focused attention other men gave to prayer. 1 pile for rent, 1 for food, 1 for church, and 1 small pile he always called tomorrow. Ada used to sit across from him, watch his hands, big, careful hands that never rushed, that never fumbled, that always knew exactly where every dollar belonged. Years later, when people spoke of his billions, she still thought of those 4 piles. After her mother died, Cornelius raised her alone. He never gave long speeches. He had 3 lessons he repeated, until they became part of her own thinking, woven into the way she moved through rooms and read people, and held herself when things became difficult. The loudest person in any room is usually the most afraid. Trust is a gift, not a weapon, and the one she would call on most on the worst day of her life. The strongest person is usually the one nobody notices. Ada was a gentle child. She believed people when they smiled at her. For a long time, that's what made her beautiful. Later, it would make her a target. Then, when she was 12 years old, something happened that would not make full sense until the morning her husband handed her divorce papers over her father's casket. One rainy evening, Cornelius came home carrying something closed in his fist. His face was different than usual, serious in a way that made the air in the small kitchen feel heavier. He said, "Ada, come sit with me." She sat across from him. He opened his hand slowly. Inside lay a worn brass key on a soft leather cord. It looked old and scratched, almost worthless, the kind of thing you'd find in a junk drawer and not think twice about. But her father held it the way you hold something irreplaceable. "What does it open?" she asked. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, "Everything." She blinked. "Everything? What does that mean?" He didn't answer directly. He leaned forward and placed the leather cord around her neck, settling the key against her sternum. "This belongs to you now," he said. "But not yet. Some doors only open when you're ready for what's behind them. You'll know when the time comes." He looked at her steadily. "Until then, keep it close, and keep it quiet." She thought it was one of his strange lessons. She nodded without understanding. She wore it anyway, under her clothes, against her heart, hidden from the world. She wore it through the years when the richer children laughed at her second-hand shoes. She wore it through her mother's illness, and then through the loss of her. She wore it through the long years of watching her father's quiet fortune slowly grow. built one careful deal at a time, one honest handshake at a time, in the unshowy way of men who don't need anyone to see them work, and she wore it the day she met Gavin. He was charming, in the easy way of men who have spent years learning that charm opens doors. He had a quick smile and an appetite for a life bigger than the one he'd started with. He made her laugh. He told her she was different from other women, and she believed him, because she had no reason yet not to. By the time they married, her father had become genuinely wealthy, though you would not have known it from the way he lived. He gave more than he kept. He showed up quietly to things that needed doing, and he watched Ada's new husband with the careful, patient eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime reading people in rooms full of those who were not what they appeared. "He looks at you like you're a step," her father told her once gently. "Not a person, a step to somewhere higher." Ada had been angry then. She defended Gavin with heat and certainty. Her father never said it again. She wore the brass key to her own wedding, hidden beneath the white of her dress, pressing against her heart as she said her vows. She didn't know it then, couldn't have known, that she was already carrying against her skin the answer to everything that was about to go wrong. The marriage didn't break in a single day. It broke slowly in small pieces, so quietly that you don't notice the damage until the whole structure is already lying in ruins at your feet. In the early years, Gavin performed the part of a good husband adequately, flowers on occasion, birthdays remembered. But Gavin had married a quiet woman, expecting a quiet fortune to come with her, and when Cornelius didn't simply hand over his empire like a wedding gift, something in Gavin began to sour. He had a strong position at a respectable firm, a career he was proud of, built, he believed entirely, on his own talent and drive. He believed himself a self-made man. The more he believed it, the more the woman beside him seemed to be something he had outgrown. And then Eleanor, his mother, began her work. She would visit their home and move through it with a slow, dissatisfied eye. She would sigh. She would mention other women, better connected women, daughters of families with the right names. Women who would have, she said, lifted her son to the heights he deserved. She said it so many times, in so many ways, that the words stopped sounding like cruelty and began to sound to Gavin like simple diagnosis. Then Simone arrived. Not all at once. Women like Simone never do. First a name, then a face at events. Then standing a little too close at parties, laughing a little too readily at Gavin's jokes. Ada noticed things, the mirrored clothing choices, the piece of jewelry that went missing from her box, the way Simone moved through rooms as if she were already measuring them for herself. Ada told herself she was imagining it. Her father had taught her to trust, so she trusted, even as the ground shifted slowly and quietly under her feet. Then came the night that turned the slow leak into a flood. Her father had fallen ill, and the doctors were honest in the way that good doctors are, honest and final. Cornelius was dying, and there was no arrangement he could make to change it. Ada spent her days at the hospital, holding his hand, reading to him, listening to him breathe. She came home late most nights to a house that felt like a shell of something that had once been alive. One of those nights, she returned to find a light in the study and voices behind the door. She stopped in the dark hallway. She listened. Gavin's voice, low, certain, the voice of a man closing a deal he was confident about, and Simone's, quieter, warmer, the voice of a woman who had already decided the outcome. She heard everything. She heard the plan, the timing, the calculation behind it, the funeral, chosen because a grieving woman wouldn't put up a fight, because the whole family would be wrapped up in mourning, because it would be clean and done before she could think clearly. Ada stood in that dark hallway and did not move. She felt something inside her go very still, the way a body goes still when the mind is catching up to something it already understood. She walked quietly back through the dark to her own room. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She picked up her phone. She did not call to cry. She did not call to report what she had heard. She called Mr. Whitfield, her father's lawyer, a calm man with a careful voice who had been waiting patiently for exactly this call. "It's Ada," she said. I think I'm ready. Can we talk? Whitfield had an office on the 14th floor of a building that Cornelius Bright had quietly financed 20 years ago and never put his name on. Ada had been there only twice before. Once as a teenager when her father signed something she wasn't old enough to understand, and once, briefly, the year she got married. Both times Whitfield had shaken her hand and looked at her with the patient, unhurried expression of a man who knew things she didn't and had no immediate need to share them. This time was different. He was waiting for her when she arrived. The office was lit softly against the late evening dark outside the window, the city laid out below in its usual indifferent grid of light. He had a folder already open on the desk and a glass of water he'd poured for her that had probably been sitting there for some time. He gestured to the chair across from him without ceremony. "I'm glad you called," he said. "Your father was hoping you would." Ada sat down. She was still wearing the coat she'd grabbed on her way out, too light for the weather, chosen fast. She'd left the house as quietly as she could, though quietly was easy now. Gavin hadn't noticed when she left. He rarely did. "He told me to trust you," she said. "He said it at the hospital. He told me to trust you and to trust the key." Whitfield looked at the brass key where it sat against her collarbone, visible above the open neck of her coat. He nodded once slowly. "Then let me tell you what the key opens," he said, "and let me tell you what's inside." He told her about the safe first. It existed in a private depository 2 blocks from this building, registered under a company name that bore no visible connection to Cornelius or to Ada or to the Bright Empire. The key Ada had worn against her skin since she was 12 opened it. That was all it did. That was all it needed to do. "Inside," Whitfield said carefully, "your father kept records. He was a methodical man, you know that." She did. He began keeping records of Gavin's financial situation approximately 4 years into your marriage. Not because he went looking for them, because things kept coming to his attention through business channels, through mutual contacts, and because your father was not a man who could unknow something once he knew it. Ada was very still in the chair. "What kind of things?" Whitfield laid out the first set of documents without drama. Gavin's debts, the ones he had never disclosed and had worked carefully to keep from Ada's awareness. Not ordinary debt, not the kind that accumulates from ambition and bad timing. Gambling losses, significant enough to require outside arrangements. Money borrowed from sources that did not operate within normal lending structures. Sources that expected to be repaid in ways that had nothing to do with contracts or courts. Ada looked at the numbers. They were not small. "He's been hiding this for years," she said. "He has." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "What else?" Whitfield opened the second section of the folder. Dates, locations, photographs. The affair documented the way her father had documented everything. Without flourish, without editorializing, with nothing included that wasn't verifiable. She didn't linger on the photographs. She had already known. She had known in the way you know something you have spent a long time trying not to know, the way the knowledge sits somewhere behind your sternum, heavy and real, waiting for you to finally let it be what it is. "There's one more thing," Whitfield said, "and I need you to understand this clearly before we go any further." He paused. "Your father opened a great many doors for Gavin over the years, without Gavin's knowledge. Through intermediaries, through professional channels, through the quiet word in the right room that redirects opportunity toward a specific destination. He did this for your sake, because you loved Gavin, because you had asked your father to let the marriage have a chance, and because your father would have carried a mountain for you if you asked him to, even a mountain that cost him something." Ada felt some tighten in her chest. How many doors? Enough that Gavin's professional network, the one he describes as the result of his own talent and effort, has very few connections that don't trace back, through one route or another, to your father, his first made promotion, the firm he joined afterward, the introductions that led to the clients that built his reputation. Whitfield paused, all of it. Ada looked down at her hands. They were folded in her lap, completely still. "He has no idea," she said. It wasn't a question. None. "He thinks he built it himself. He does." She was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to become something else, not silence, but the particular quality of air that forms when a person is recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the architecture of their own life. "And now," she said, "those doors belong to you," Whitfield said, "along with everything else." He explained the will then, clearly and completely. No conditions, no trusts with committees and co-administrators, no shared authority. Cornelius had structured it with deliberate simplicity. Every asset, every entity, every account that operated under the Bright name, or any of its subsidiaries, would pass in full to his daughter upon his death. The entire empire, every building, every company, every investment, every holding, valued at the most recent assessment at just under $20 billion. Ada listened without interrupting. When he finished, the room was very quiet. "He always knew about Gavin," she said finally. "From early on, yes. He never said anything. He told me once," Whitfield said carefully, "that it wasn't his marriage to end. That you had chosen Gavin and that he would respect that choice. He said the only thing a father can do is make sure his daughter lands safely when the time comes, and then he made sure." Ada pressed her thumb to the back of the brass key, feeling the scratched surface, the familiar weight of it. She had carried it for so many years without knowing what it unlocked. She had worn it to her wedding, her mother's memorial, every difficult morning and quiet evening of the years that had brought her here. "What do I do now?" she asked. Whitfield was straightforward. He told her that Gavin, by divorcing her before the will was read, would have no legal claim to any portion of the estate, but only if the divorce was finalized before the reading. Given Gavin's plan, given the timeline he and Simone had designed so carefully, this presented a particular irony. Gavin was going to execute the divorce at the worst possible moment for Ada, not knowing that by doing so, he was executing it at the worst possible moment for himself. "He's going to hand you the papers at the funeral," Whitfield said. "I know," Ada said. "If you sign them." "I'll sign them," she said quietly. "He wants me to. My father told me, let them show you who they are." She looked up. "I've seen it now, all of it. I'll sign." Whitfield nodded. He told her about the will reading scheduled for the Saturday after the burial. He told her she should be there. He told her she didn't need to say a word until she was ready to say everything. She stood to leave. At the door she paused. "He said I would know when I was ready." She touched the key. "When did he think I would be ready?" Whitfield looked at her. This woman, in a coat too light for the weather, a brass K around her neck, who had just heard the scope of everything her father had built and everything her husband had squandered, and had sat through it all without her hands shaking once, he thought. Whitfield said that when the time came, you would already know the answer to that question. She walked out of the office and into the night, and behind her the city went on burning with its usual indifferent light, and she held the key close against her chest, and she did not cry. She had 2 days left with her father. She intended to spend them well. The marriage had not always felt like something breaking. In the early years, there were moments that seemed genuine, a dinner where Gavin pulled her chair out with the easy warmth of a man who still wanted to impress her, a Sunday morning when he'd driven 40 minutes to find the specific coffee she liked because the usual place was closed. Small things. She held on to them for a long time after they stopped coming. She held on to them past the point where holding on was useful because she had been raised to believe that love was something you stayed faithful to even when it cost you, and because she had no template for what leaving looked like. The unraveling was slow, the way water removes stone. Not through force, but through persistence, through the same motion repeated until the surface gives. Gavin's ambition was the first thing she truly understood wrong. She had mistaken it for drive, for the same quality her father had possessed, the willingness to work hard and build something worth having. But her father's ambition had always had a direction beyond himself. Gavin's pointed only inward. He wanted things for what they said about him. The title, the floor, the table at the restaurant that required a certain name to book. And when those things accumulated without accelerating fast enough, he began to look at the woman he had married and see something that was slowing him down. He was wrong about this. Ada had never once slowed him down. She had made the house function, managed their finances with a precision he never bothered to notice, and quietly ensured that his professional life ran smoothly through 100 small acts of support he had stopped seeing years ago. But a man who has decided someone is a burden rarely stops to audit the evidence. Eleanor was steady fuel. She called often, more than Ada knew, because those calls happened when Ada was out or in another room, voices low. But Ada heard enough, over enough years, to understand the shape of it. The dissatisfied sighs during visits, the way Eleanor would look around the house as if searching for something that had gone missing, the mentions of women with better family names, women with connections, women who could have opened more doors for her son. "You could have done better," Eleanor told Gavin. Not once, but as a refrain, a thing she said so often it had become less like criticism and more like weather, something that was simply always present, always pressing. Ada never responded to Eleanor directly. She had been raised to handle difficult people with patience, and she understood that some arguments cannot be won because the other party has already decided on the verdict. So she remained civil, remained steady, and watched the effect of Eleanor's words accumulate in Gavin like sediment, slowly changing the composition of what she could see in his eyes when he looked at her. Simone arrived without announcement. The way a slow tide arrives, you don't realize the water has reached feet until you are already standing in it. She appeared first at a firm event, a face in the room, nothing memorable. Then a name dropped into a conversation that didn't require her. Simone mentioned something about the Hargrove account that might be useful. Then a face at the parties they attended together, where she laughed at the right moments, and moved with the comfortable ease of someone who had long ago stopped worrying about whether she belonged. She stood close to Gavin without appearing to, close in the way of someone who has measured exactly how close she can stand without being obvious about measuring. Ada noticed. She was not a stupid woman. She noticed the way Gavin reached for his phone, a little more often in the evenings, angling the screen away. She noticed the new performance of busyness, late at the office, unavailable in ways that had no clear professional explanation, tired in a way that seemed to arrive in the evening but had not been present that morning. She noticed, and she examined what she noticed, and she told herself, with the deep self-protective instinct of someone who knows that verification will cost her something she is not ready to lose, that she might be imagining it. She wore the brass key. It had become such a part of her that she no longer consciously thought about it, the small weight of it against her sternum, the way the leather cord moved slightly when she breathed. She had worn it so long, it had become as much a part of her body as her own pulse. She touched it sometimes when things were difficult, not as a superstition but as a kind of ballast, a reminder that her father had trusted her with something he considered important. Then the brooch disappeared. It had been her mother's, a small gold piece shaped like a bird in flight, not an expensive thing, not the kind of jewelry that gets assessed and insured and kept in a bank box. Just a small gold bird on a pin, the kind her mother had worn to church, and to the occasional dinner, and to every event that mattered. After her mother passed, it had come to Ada. She had kept it in the wooden box on her dresser, wrapped in a small square of velvet, not because she wore it often, but because it was her mother's, and her mother was gone, and objects are the residue that love leaves behind. She noticed it missing on a Tuesday evening in late autumn. She checked the spot twice. She checked the dresser, the bathroom counter, the small dish on the bedside table, where she sometimes dropped things without thinking. She went through her coat pockets. She asked Gavin, in as ordinary a voice as she could manage, whether he had seen it moved. He said he hadn't, and his eyes didn't change, and she was left alone with the fact of its absence and the slow, sickening question forming beneath the ordinary surface of the evening. She told herself she had simply misplaced it. She was tired. She had been preoccupied with her father's declining health, with the weight of watching him slow and diminish in ways that could not be fixed. Things got lost, people got distracted, but she kept looking for it, in small ways, in the weeks that followed. She never found it. She didn't know yet that it was gone deliberately. She didn't know yet that it had been given, not lost, not borrowed, but given to a woman who wore it the way you wear something that has already been decided is yours. She didn't know that Simone had admired it in a photograph she'd found on Gavin's phone, and that Gavin, wanting to give her something that felt like intimacy, had taken it from the woman who actually owned it and given it to the woman who only wanted what that woman had. Ada kept her composure through the months that followed. Her father's condition worsened through the winter. She went to the hospital most days. She held his hand. She read to him from books he'd loved. She watched his face for the changes that meant time was running out. She was so focused on losing him in the proper way, in the terrible ordinary human way of watching someone you love leave slowly, that she did not fully attend to what was also happening in her own house. The night she heard Gavin and Simone through the study door was the night she stopped managing what she felt and let herself feel it. She stood in the dark hallway, still in her coat from the hospital, her keys still in her hand, and she listened. And what she heard was not a revelation, it was a confirmation. It was the thing she had been careful not to know for a long time, finally presented to her in language so plain and practical that there was nowhere left to put it except exactly where it belonged. They had planned the day. They had chosen the venue. They had calculated that a woman at her father's funeral would not have the strength to resist. Ada stood there and listened to all of it and did not move until they were finished. Then she walked quietly through the dark to the stairs, climbed them without a sound, went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, with her coat still on and the keys still in her hand. She thought of her father at 12 pressing a brass key into her palm. She thought of what he had told her. The strongest person is usually the one nobody notices. And then she did something Gavin would never have predicted. She did not cry. She did not confront him. She did not pack a bag or demand an explanation. She sat on the edge of the bed until the house was fully quiet, and then she picked up her phone and called the only person she trusted with what she now knew. Whitfield answered on the second ring. "I think it's time," Ada said. "Can I come to you?" He told her yes. He told her when. And then he told her quietly that her father had hoped she would call, and that there was a great deal she needed to understand before the week was out. Cornelius Bright died on a Wednesday morning, just before 8, with Ada's hand in his and the brass key resting warm against her chest beneath her blouse. The room was quiet. The light through the hospital window was grey and directionless, the kind of early morning light that doesn't commit to anything. His breath had been changing over the past several hours. She had learned to hear the difference, and when it stopped without drama, the way he had done most things in his life. She sat with him for a while afterward. She didn't rush. The nurses left her alone with him, the way they do when they recognize a person who needs time and has earned the right to take it. She held his hand until it was no longer warm, and then she sat a while longer, and she let herself understand what it meant for him to be gone. Her father had been her first and most reliable proof that the world contained people who would tell you the truth even when it was difficult, who would love you without demanding that you be easier to love, who would put something precious into your hands and trust you to figure out what to do with it. Without him, she would have to carry that proof inside herself. She had known it was coming. She had been preparing. That did not make it simple. She drove herself home. She did not call Gavin from the hospital. He found out through the notification chain she had arranged with the administrative staff, practical and impersonal, the way you learn about things from institutions. By the time she arrived back at the house, he was in the kitchen, dressed but not ready to leave, making the particular performance of concern that she recognized now as something he practiced rather than felt. "I'm sorry," he said. He sounded almost genuine. She thought, "You planned this, and you are sorry in the way a person is sorry that the weather is poor." "Thank you," she said, because she had nothing else to give him, and because her energy was now entirely directed elsewhere. The next 2 days existed in the hollow space that forms between a death and a burial. She coordinated the arrangements. She handled the calls that needed handling. She responded to the messages that arrived from people who had known and respected Cornelius. The list of those people was long, far longer than anyone who had only known Cornelius in his private life would have expected, because he had been a man of significant reach, and because the people he had helped over the years were not always people who announced their gratitude publicly. Gavin was present, but peripheral during those days. He moved through the house with the careful helpfulness of a man managing his own discomfort. He offered to handle things. She assigned him small tasks. He completed them. They circled each other with the practiced civility of two people who have stopped telling the truth to each other and are maintaining the form of a marriage without any of the substance. She did not tell him what she knew. She did not let on, even once. She had visited her father 2 evenings before he passed. The visit Whitfield had arranged, the one Cornelius had specifically requested. That evening at the hospital had changed the way she held herself in her own house. She had gone in carrying dread and grief and the exhausted weight of months of anticipation. She had left carrying something else, the clarity of a woman who has finally been told the full truth about her own life and found that she is strong enough to hold it. In the low light of the hospital room, her father had taken her hand. His grip was weak but deliberate. He had reached up with his other hand and touched the brass key through her blouse. "You still have it," he whispered. Something moved across his tired face that might have been relief. "Good. I never took it off," she said. "I know." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. They were clear, clearer than they had been in weeks. "Soon," he said. "Soon you'll understand what it opens. Trust Whitfield. He has the instructions. He'll walk you through every piece." He paused, and Ada, his eyes found hers and held them. "Don't you make a sound. Let them show you who they are. You already know who they are, but let them show you in front of the people who matter, so that everyone else knows too." "I won't make a sound," she said. "When the time comes, you'll know." He pressed her hand, "And then you show them who you are." She had held his hand and nodded, and she had meant it in the deep, uncomplicated way that you mean things to a dying father at the end of a long and honest relationship. 2 mornings later, she buried him. The church was full.
More than full.
People lined the back walls, stood in the vestibule, spilled onto the steps outside in the grey November cold. Half the city had come for Cornelius Bright. Ada sat in the front pew in a borrowed black dress. She had deliberately chosen not to wear anything of her own, not to spend any energy on appearance, because she had wanted to look exactly the way they expected her to look. Diminished, small, a woman stripped to her essentials by grief. The pastor began to speak, and then she felt the cold of the documents in her hands. She looked down before she understood what they were. Gavin had slid them into her lap with the practiced discretion of a man who had rehearsed this moment, who had decided exactly how close to hold them, exactly how to angle his body, so the transaction was visible to no one directly behind him. She felt his breath at her ear. "Sign it," he whispered. "Don't make a scene. Not here." She looked up. At his shoulder, standing close and still in calf black, was Simone. And around Simone's neck, just visible above the neckline of her dress, was the small gold brooch, the bird in flight, her mother's. The wave of recognition was physical. Ada felt it move through her like cold water. The knowledge arriving not as surprise but as confirmation, the final piece set into place with a precision that could only have been intentional. Simone had worn it here deliberately. She had worn it to the funeral of the woman from whom it had been taken, at the moment when the woman it had been taken from was most vulnerable. Around them, the mourners had gone still. Not the still of grief, a different quality of still, the held breath quiet of 200 people witnessing something they couldn't quite believe. She could feel it, the collective shock of the room pressing against the back of her neck. One row behind, Eleanor sat with her chin level, and the corners of her mouth arranged into the expression of a woman who has waited a very long time for a particular satisfaction and has finally arrived at it. Ada looked at the casket, at the flowers piled high around the man who had counted dollars in 4 piles on a kitchen table on Sunday nights and told her, over and over, in every way he knew how, the strongest person is usually the one nobody notices. She looked at the papers in her lap, her name already printed there, neat and final. She picked up the pen, her hand did not shake. She signed. Gavin exhaled. It was a small sound, the sound of a man releasing a tension he had been carrying for months. She heard it clearly. She filed it away. Simone's shoulders dropped the smallest fraction. Eleanor's chin dipped once in quiet acknowledgement. They believed it was over. Ada down the pen. Something passed across her face that she didn't try to control. Not grief, not defeat. Something older and quieter than either. Something that lived in a part of her that had been wearing a brass key for 25 years and finally understood what it was for. At the back of the church, near the open doors where the hearse waited in the November light, Mr. Whitfield stood with his hands folded over a sealed envelope that bore Ada's name. He had been there the whole time. He had watched everything. His face had not moved. He would not move until the burial was finished. But Ada knew he was there, and in the lowest part of the service, when the pastor's words washed over her, and the grief of her father's absence was real and complete and deserved, she held the knowledge of Whitfield's presence. She had always held the brass key, close and quiet, pressed against the part of herself that had been trained, from the age of 12, to keep the important things hidden until the right door appeared. The service ended. The procession formed. Her father was carried out under a grey sky and put into the ground on a hill with a view of the city he had helped build. When it was done, Whitfield crossed the cemetery toward her, the sealed envelope finally in his outstretched hand. "Your father's instructions," he said, "were that this be opened after the burial. Not one moment before." He placed it in her hands. He was a very precise man. Ada looked at the envelope, her name in her father's handwriting, the careful, deliberate script of a man who wrote as if every word cost something and was worth paying for. She opened it. She read it quietly. When she was finished, she stood for a long moment looking at the city in the distance, and at the headstone and at the place where the earth had been turned over her father's grave. Then she folded the letter and put it into her coat pocket, next to her heart. "Saturday," Whitfield said. "The building's main boardroom. 10 o'clock. "I'll be there," Ada said. She drove herself home in the grey afternoon light and did not speak to Gavin when she arrived. She went to her room, and she sat with her father's letter in her hand, and she let herself, finally, fully, understand the dimensions of what he had left her. Not just the money, not just the empire, the patience behind it, the decades of careful, quiet, deliberate work aimed not at the accumulation of power, but at the protection of a daughter he had always known was stronger than the world had thought to give her credit for. She did not sleep much that night. But, for the first time in a very long time, the wakefulness felt different. Not the wakefulness of fear, the wakefulness of someone who has finally seen the full picture and is deciding what to do with it. Saturday arrived with the particular cold clarity of late autumn, the sky a pale, washed-out blue, the air sharp enough to make your breath visible. Ada was up before 6. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table in the house. She would soon be leaving, and looked at the city through the window and thought about her father at a different kitchen table a long time ago, counting 4 small piles of money in the lamplight. She had spent Friday alone. Gavin had gone out in the morning and hadn't come back until late, and she hadn't asked where. She had spent the day reading through the documents, Whitfield had prepared for her, not the will, which she'd had read to her in pieces over the past weeks, but the supporting materials, the company histories, the asset inventories, the trust structures, the subsidiary arrangements through which Cornelius Bright had quietly organized 30 years of accumulated enterprise. She read all of it carefully, methodically, with the focused attention of someone who understands that information is the thing that keeps you from being caught off guard. By the time Saturday morning came, she was not afraid. She dressed with care, not with the excessive care of someone performing confidence, the kind of thing that shows, but with the quiet precision of a person who understands that how you enter a room matters, and who has given thought to what she wanted the room to receive. She chose a dark suit, fitted and correct, the kind her father would have recognized as appropriate for the work ahead. She had bought it 2 years ago for a board gala she'd attended with Gavin, a night when he'd introduced her to 3 senior partners and then drifted away to talk to people he considered more useful. She'd spent most of that evening standing near the window with a glass of wine she barely touched, watching the city below and thinking about nothing in particular. The suit had spent 2 years in the back of the closet since then. She stood at the mirror and looked at herself, really looked, without the automatic editing that had become habitual over the course of the marriage, the instinct to minimize what she saw. Then she reached up and unhooked the brass key from around her neck. She held it for a moment. She had never worn it outside her clothing. In 25 years, she had never once let it be visible. She had kept it close and kept it quiet, exactly the way her father had told her to. She looked at the key, the worn leather cord, the scratched brass face that had been against her skin through every season of her adult life. She placed it back around her neck and left it where it was, on top of her blouse, outside her jacket, visible to anyone who cared to look. Then she picked up her bag and walked out of the house. Whitfield had arranged for a car. It waited at the curb, quiet and unremarkable, driven by a man she'd never met, who said nothing and asked nothing and navigated the Saturday morning city with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has done this kind of thing many times. Ada sat in the back, watched the streets move past and let the stillness that had settled into her over the last several days hold her. The bright building rose above the surround blocks, the quiet authority of something that has been there long enough that people have stopped noticing it. 40 floors of glass and steel, Cornelius's name on nothing visible from the street. That had been his preference always, to build things that spoke for themselves and let other people put their names on the facades. Ada had been in this building many times. She had grown up partly in its shadow. But she had never walked into it the way she walked into it that morning, which was as the person it belonged to. The lobby was marble and clean light. The security desk recognized her and passed her through without hesitation. Whitfield had made the arrangements, and the building's staff, the ones who had been there long enough to know what they were actually dealing with, treated her with the steady deference of people who understand the real organizational chart of a thing. She rode the elevator to the top floor. The boardroom was a long glass room that looked out over the city on 3 sides, the kind of room designed to make everyone in it feel the specific smallness that comes from altitude and transparency. Whitfield was already there, seated at the head of the long table with a sealed envelope and a thin folder set neatly in front of him. 2 additional attorneys flanked him at the near end of the table. Gavin arrived 7 minutes later with Simone on his arm. He was wearing the most expensive suit Ada had ever seen him in, clearly new, purchased recently, chosen for this occasion. He moved through the room with the deliberate ease of a man who has decided in advance that this will go well for him. Simone wore something dark and understated and looked around the room with the attentive expression of a woman conducting a quiet inventory. Eleanor came in behind them, her chin level, her handbag held close. She had dressed as if for a formal occasion she expected to find satisfying. None of them looked as surprised that Ada was there. She had rights as the surviving family member, after all. What they might have expected was the woman from the funeral, the borrowed dress, the signed papers, the quiet defeat. What they were not prepared for was the suit, or the key. It was Simone who noticed it first. Her eyes snagged on the brass key lying openly against Ada's lapel, and something in her expression shifted imperceptibly, quickly controlled. Gavin saw it a moment later. His forward movement slowed by half a step, his smirk, the one that had been arranging itself on his face since they arrived, lost some of its confidence and hung there unencored. Eleanor's eyes went to the key and stayed there. Ada crossed the room without hurrying. She took the empty chair directly across from the three of them, set her bag on the floor beside her, folded her hands on the cool glass surface of the table. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. Her voice was steady. "Go ahead. Read it." Whitfield looked around the room once, slowly, deliberately, the kind of look that makes it clear nothing in it has been missed. Then he broke the seal on the envelope. He read the will clause by clause, in the unhurried voice of a man who has performed this function many times and understands that the words carry their own weight without embellishment. Cornelius Bright, of sound mind, having considered the matter with the depth of attention he had given every significant decision of his life, left everything to his daughter Ada. Not a portion carefully calibrated to avoid conflict. Not a managed arrangement overseen by committees. Everything, every entity, every asset, every account, every investment operating under the Bright name, or any of its related structures. The entire estate, valued at just under $20 billion, passed in full, unconditionally, to Ada. The clause about spouses explicitly noted, in the event that Ada's marriage had been legally dissolved prior to the date of this reading, no spousal claim would be recognized, as only a legal spouse at the time of reading would qualify for consideration. The divorce, finalized and witnessed at the funeral, with Gavin's own signature and the signatures of 2 witnesses from among the mourners who had stepped forward quietly at Whitfield's prior request, had been registered the previous afternoon. The room went very quiet. Gavin's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Simone's hand, which had been resting on his forearm, slipped away slowly into her own lap. Eleanor did not move, but something behind her eyes was doing rapid, failing arithmetic. "That's not possible," Gavin said. His voice had lost the smoothness it carried when he was confident. "We were married for 9 years. I have rights to. There are laws about." He stopped. "Started again. I have a claim." Ada looked at him across the table. She did not raise her voice. She did not lean forward. She remained perfectly still and perfectly calm, the kind of calm that comes not from indifference but from preparation. "You signed it away," she said. "At the funeral, in front of 200 people, you ended our marriage. Yourself. With your own hand. The morning my father was buried. Before a single word of this will was ever read aloud," she let the silence hold for just a moment. "You were in such a hurry to be free of me, Gavin, that you set yourself free of everything." Whitfield set the will aside and picked up the thin folder from beneath it. "There is one additional matter," he said, "pertaining to certain records maintained by the late Mr. Bright." Gavin went very still. Whitfield opened the folder and explained, in his measured, factual way, what the brass key around Ada's neck had been protecting for the past 25 years, the debts, the affairs, the documented evidence of how thoroughly Gavin's professional network, the one he had built his identity around, the thing he was proudest of, the proof of his own self-made success, traced at almost every significant node, back to quiet interventions made by Cornelius Bright through intermediaries and careful channel management, without Gavin's knowledge, for Gavin's wife's sake, because Gavin's wife had asked her father to give the marriage a chance. Gavin sat across the table and understood something, slowly, and then all at once, with the specific horror of a man who has spent years being certain he was right and is now watching that certainty collapse into the floor. Ada reached up and touched the key where it rested against her chest. "He told me," she said quietly, That some doors only open when you're ready for what's behind them. She looked at the key for a moment. I wasn't ready for a long time. She looked up. I am now. The boardroom meeting did not end with shouting. That was the part that seemed to surprise people afterward, those who heard about it through the quiet channels through which things like this always travel in a city where everyone who matters is connected to everyone else by at most 2 degrees. People expected drama. People expected the scene, the wronged woman standing up and delivering the accounting of every grievance in one cathartic torrent, the humiliated husband reduced to open apology, the mistress shamed in front of witnesses, the mother-in-law finally brought low by the full weight of her own cruelty. The kind of justice that comes with raised voices and visible tears and a moment you could photograph if anyone had been photographing it. That was not what happened. What happened was that Whitfield finished reading and finished explaining, and the 3 people across the table sat with what they had just heard and were unable, for a long moment, to produce words adequate to the situation. And Ada sat on her side of the glass table, with her hands folded and the brass key visible against her chest, and waited with the patience of a woman who had learned patience from one of its masters. Gavin tried twice more to assert some claim, first through the argument that the divorce had been procedurally irregular, then through the argument that the marriage had lasted 9 years and equity demanded some recognition of that. Both arguments died quickly. Whitfield addressed them with the particular calm of a man who has anticipated every objection and prepared his responses in advance, which he had, because Cornelius had specifically asked him to. Simone said nothing during this. She had the self-possession of a person who understands when a situation has shifted irrevocably and adjusts her position accordingly. She sat quietly, and her expression had the quality of someone doing private calculations about what came next. Not for Gavin, Ada understood, but for herself. Simone had always been doing calculations for herself. That had always been the whole of her project. Eleanor spoke once briefly, directing a question at Whitfield about the family trust arrangements she had understood to be in place. Whitfield told her, gently and precisely, that the arrangements she was describing did not exist as she had understood them. The support structures that had maintained certain aspects of the extended family's financial situation, quietly, without being discussed, by a man who had been making peace possible for his daughter's sake without asking for acknowledgement, would not be continuing. She received this information without visible reaction, though something behind her eyes did something complicated that Ada chose not to examine. Then Whitfield said that concluded the formal portion of the reading, and that any further questions of a legal nature should be directed to his office in writing, and the meeting was done. Gavin and Simone left first. Gavin did not look at Ada on his way out. He moved with the stiffness of a man in physical pain, not wounded exactly, but compressed, the volume of himself reduced by the force of something he had not seen coming and was not yet equipped to process. Simone walked beside him with a slight distance between them that she hadn't bothered to close, as if the gravitational pull that had kept her orbit synchronized with his was already beginning to decay. Eleanor followed without speaking. At the door she paused briefly, and Ada thought she was going to say something, some final repositioning of herself, some attempt at dignity, but she only looked at Ada for one moment, with an expression Ada could not fully read, and then she walked out. Ada sat alone in the boardroom with Whitfield and the 2 attorneys. "Well," Whitfield said. "Yes," Ada agreed. Outside the glass walls, the city occupied itself with the ordinary Saturday business of being a city. 40 floors below, people walked in the cold and drove in traffic, and conducted the 1,000 transactions of an ordinary morning. None of them knew that this room had just shifted something significant, the way rooms sometimes do without anyone else in the world being aware of it. Whitfield walked her through the practical next steps, the formal transfer of assets, which would proceed over the following weeks through the legal and administrative channels he had already put in motion. The company registrations, the board notifications, the financial institutions. He was thorough and he was unhurried, and he answered every question she asked without making her feel that any question was less than important. She asked about the company where Gavin worked. Whitfield told her it fell under one of the Bright Umbrella's subsidiary holdings, and that it was hers to manage as she chose. She chose to think about that for several days before doing anything. She did not act from emotion. That was the thing she was most careful about in the weeks that followed, the thing she was most deliberate about. Not because she didn't feel things, she felt everything. The grief of her father's absence was real and present and would be for a long time. The anger at what Gavin and Simone had done, at the coldness of its calculation, at the specific cruelty of the timing, at the theft of her mother's brooch and the use it had been put to, that anger was also real. She did not pretend otherwise to herself, but she also understood, in a way that her father had taught her and her own long years of living quietly in other people's assumptions had confirmed, that the best decisions are not the ones made in the loudest moments. They are the ones made in the calm that comes after. She moved out. The house, within the week. It had been hers to begin with. She'd known that technically, without ever asserting it, and she found an apartment near her father's building and began the process of organizing her new life in a space that felt, for the first time in years, entirely her own. She hired a small team of people she trusted, recommended by Whitfield, vetted carefully, people who had worked with Cornelius and knew the shape of what they were walking into. She spent her first 2 weeks learning the operations, the rhythms of the various companies, the key relationships, the decisions that were pending, the ones that could wait. She called in the people who had been managing things in the interim, and she listened more than she spoke, which had always come naturally to her, and which served her considerably better as an executive than she had any reason to expect. The restructuring of the firm where Gavin had worked came 3 weeks after the boardroom meeting. Ada had thought about it carefully. She had considered what it meant to use her control over someone's livelihood as an instrument of punishment, and she had decided that she was not comfortable with that framing. She was not in the business of punishment. She was in the business of running a company correctly. What she was comfortable with was restructuring correctly. The division where Gavin had held his executive position was genuinely redundant. 2 of its primary functions overlapped with another branch of the same holding. The elimination of the role was appropriate on the merits. She would have made the same decision about any other person in the same position. The letter that went out was formal and final and polite, single-spaced, printed on good paper, exactly the kind of document that closes a chapter without flourish. A letter not unlike the one he had pressed into her hands in the front pew of a church full of mourners. She didn't think about this parallel when she signed the restructuring approval, but she was aware of it. Gavin received it at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon. She was told he sat there for a long time afterward, not moving, the letter open in front of him, with the particular stillness of a man trying to understand something that his available frameworks are insufficient to explain. He had built his professional identity on the conviction that he was self-made, that every success was a function of his own talent, his own drive, his own strategic intelligence. He had looked at the man who had provided the connections that built his career and seen nothing worth noticing. A quiet old man with no obvious power, easily dismissed, easily filed away as a footnote to the real story, which had always, in Gavin's accounting, been about himself. The letter told him that his position had been eliminated and wished him well in future endeavors. It was signed by a name he didn't recognize, a name from the new management team, but it came from a company whose ownership he now understood entirely, and the understanding arrived in the way that true reckonings always do, all at once, the full weight of it, with nowhere to redirect the force. Without the bright connections, the phones stopped being answered. The doors that had always opened, closed, not dramatically, not with ceremony. They simply no longer responded to his hand on the handle, the way doors don't when the key that was always making them work has been quietly returned to its rightful owner. He was not destroyed, he was not ruined in the sensational way of people in stories who deserve to be brought low for the satisfaction of the audience. The sigh reduced, accurately proportionally to the size of the thing he had actually been all along, stripped of the borrowed architecture that had made him appear larger. That was consequence enough. Simone left him before the month was out. It happened without crisis, without confrontation. She simply was there one day, and then, gradually wasn't, her belongings disappearing in increments the way her presence had arrived, piece by piece, until the house was quiet, and there was only Gavin left in it, with the paperwork of his situation, and the knowledge of how he had arrived at it. She took the brooch when she left. The small gold bird in flight, the thing that had been Ada's mother's, the thing that had been given away as if it were nothing. Ada heard about it through practical channels, inventory questions, some items of Ada's that had needed to be retrieved from the house. She considered having the brooch returned. She thought about it for perhaps half a day. Then she decided to let it go. She had stopped measuring her inheritance by the things that could be taken from her. Eleanor's situation resolved itself without as direct involvement, which was how Ada preferred it. The quiet financial infrastructure that Cornelius had maintained, the arrangements that had smoothed over certain difficulties, covered certain shortfalls, kept certain comfortable assumptions intact for years, simply ceased. It had been maintained out of love for a daughter and loyalty to a relationship, and those reasons no longer applied. Eleanor learned the dimensions of what she had been standing on, and learned them alone, in the way that people learn things about the foundations of their own lives when the foundation is no longer there to be taken for granted. Ada did not contact her. She received no contact from Eleanor either. She did not anticipate that she would. What she did instead was work. She took up the empire the way her father had built it, quietly, steadily, with close attention, and no need for recognition. She ran the companies the way he had run them, with care for the people inside them, with patience for the processes that required decisiveness when decisiveness was needed, and deliberation when it wasn't. The people who had once arranged their behavior in rooms according to what they understood her power to be, which had been none, now found themselves sitting across from her at the long glass table and adjusting in ways that ranged from discomfort to genuine surprise to the reality of what she actually was. She treated them fairly. She listened when they spoke. She did not use her position to remind them of the discrepancy between how they had behaved before and how they were behaving now. She in small house and in a cold marriage, exactly what it felt like to be the person in the room that everyone else looked through. She had decided, somewhere on the long road from there to here, that she would not make anyone feel that way on her account. This was not nobility. It was not for performed graciousness. It was simply what she had decided was right, and she had always been good at doing what she had decided was right. Months passed. She found her rhythm. The grief for her father came in waves, as grief does, at unexpected moments, a phrase she'd heard him use appearing in a business document, the particular quality of an early morning that reminded her of Sunday evenings at the kitchen table. She let the grief come when it came and worked around it when she had to work and kept moving. She did not think about Gavin often. When she did, it was not with bitterness. She had found that bitterness was not a sustainable orientation. It took too much maintenance. She thought of him the way you think of a hard season that is behind you, with the residual awareness of what it had cost, but without the impulse to go back and stand in it again. Then, on a quiet afternoon in late spring, there was a knock at the door of her office. Her assistant came in to say that there was someone asking to see her. Not an appointment, just someone at the desk, asking. The name was familiar, and yet changed somehow, reduced, like a word that has lost its resonance through overuse. She told her assistant to send him in. Gavin looked like a man who had slept poorly for a sustained period, and had stopped attempting to disguise it. The suit was still good, old habits being the last things to go, but it fit differently than it used to, as if he had lost mass from the inside out, the structure of him having contracted slightly, without anyone being able to say exactly where. He stood in the doorway of Ada's office for a moment before she gestured to the chair, and he came in carefully, the way you enter a space you once had opinions about and no longer have any right to. He sat down. He placed his hands in his lap. He did not look at the key. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing me." Ada said nothing, which was not unkindness. She simply had not yet determined what would be appropriate. And she had learned from her father that silence is not a void to be filled, but a pressure that reveals what is actually present. He started with the early years. She had expected that, the strategic placement of good memories, at the beginning, the reminder that there had been something real before the unraveling. He spoke of specific things. An evening early in their marriage when they had eaten takeout on the apartment floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet, and it had been funny rather than stressful. A drive they'd taken one August through the mountains, no particular destination, small things, real things. She could verify them. They had happened. She noticed that he had chosen memories in which she was the one laughing, as if her happiness in the past were a debt he was now calling in. Then he moved on. His mother's influence offered as partial explanation. The pressure of his professional situation, the fear of not becoming the person he believed he was supposed to be, the way Simone had arrived at exactly the wrong moment, or the right one, depending on which version of events you were willing to accept. He spoke in the language of mitigation without using the word. He described his actions in the passive voice, where possible, as things that had happened rather than things he had done. Ada listened. She did not interrupt. She had promised herself she would listen completely before she responded to anything, because she had spent too many years responding to partial information. When he stopped speaking, the office was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the city went on being the city. Below, the street was doing its ordinary afternoon things. "Is there any way back?" he asked. His voice was very small, smaller than she had ever heard it. "Any door you'd be willing to leave open? Any part of what we had that you'd consider?" He stopped. "I'm not asking for everything. I'm not asking you to." Another stop. "I just want to know if there's anything." Ada looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him and she waited for the anger to arrive. She expected it. She had been carrying so much of it for so long, the accumulation of the cold mornings and the late evenings and the thousand and small acts of dismissal and the calculated cruelty of the funeral and the brooch and the planning she had overheard in the dark hallway. She had expected it to be present at a moment like this one, readily accessible, a reliable response. It wasn't there. What was there instead was something cleaner, not absence, not the numbness that had carried her through the worst of it. Something more active than that, something that had been growing in the quiet space behind the grief and the work and the long process of learning who she was in the absence of a marriage that had slowly convinced her she was less than she was. It was clarity, the view from her father's building on a clear day. Everything visible for miles, nothing obscuring the distances, the world arranged in its actual proportions rather than the distorted close-up of a life lived under the wrong assumptions. She did not hatred. She did not feel the warm satisfaction of revenge which she had sometimes imagined she would feel at this moment in the bad nights, in the way you imagine things that you later discover you didn't actually want. She felt, instead, a kind of settled understanding of who this man was, of what she had been in his life, and what he had been in hers, of what the last 9 years had cost, and what they had taught her, and what she was prepared to carry forward, and what she was not. She reached into her bag. The divorce papers were there as they had been for the past several weeks, finalized, complete, every signature in place, every legal formality resolved. She had been carrying them with a purpose she hadn't fully articulated to herself until this moment. She drew them out. She set them on the desk between them, folded exactly as they had been folded in her lap on the morning of her father's funeral. "You gave me these," she said softly, "the morning we buried my father, in front of the people who came to honor him." Before the pastor had finished his opening prayer, she looked at the papers. "Your hand didn't shake when you pressed them into mine." Gavin looked at the papers. He said nothing. "Mine didn't either," she said. "When I signed." She pushed them across the desk, slowly, fold by fold, the way he had once pressed them into her hands. "Now they're yours to keep," she said. He reached out and took them. She watched his hand close around them, the same hand that had held them in the church, sure and certain, and already counting the benefits. The hand looked older now. The certainty was gone from it. He stood an instinct, nothing more. "I'm not angry at you," she said. She meant it, and she could hear in her own voice that she meant it, and she knew it was true in the unperformative way that true things are. "I want you to understand that. This is not what anger looks like. This is what finished looks like. There's a difference." He looked at her. He looked at the key resting openly against her chest. He seemed to want to say something and could not find the shape of it. "Take care of yourself," she said. The words were simple and she meant them simply, not warmly, not coldly. The way you mean things to a stranger you are not going to see again and wish no particular harm. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the door. "Ada," he said. His voice was low, uncertain. She paused. She did not turn around. "He was right about me," Gavin said. "Your father, he was right, and I knew it, and I kept telling myself he wasn't." She considered this. "He was right about most things," she said. "It wasn't a talent unique to you." Then she walked out of her own office and down the corridor and into the elevator and through the lobby and out into the afternoon. She walked for a while without any particular destination, just walked the way her father used to walk, when he had something to settle himself, unhurried, through the city that had always been more his than it appeared. She did not cry, she did not feel the release she had sometimes imagined at this moment, the great cathartic exhale of 9 years' worth of accumulated weight. What she felt was smaller than that, and more real, the particular quietness of a thing that is finished, all the way finished, with no threads left hanging anywhere. At some point she stopped at a corner and looked up at her father's building rising above the other buildings, its glass, its height, its ordinary unshowy presence among the skyline. It did not have his name on it. He would not have wanted that, she thought. "I know you now, a little better than before. Not the money, not the building, the part that decided to trust a 12-year-old with a brass key and wait for her to find the door." She started walking again. Spring was doing what spring does, the cold releasing its grip degree by degree, the trees finding their color slowly, the mornings arriving a little earlier each day. She had work to do. She had always had work to do. For the first time in a very long time, the work felt like the right kind. That evening, she stood at her apartment window and looked at the city in the late light and thought about her father counting his 4 piles of money and saying, "Tomorrow." She had always loved that pile best, even as a child, the one set aside not for what was owed or needed or required, but for what might yet be possible. She thought, "I have a great deal of tomorrow left." Then she made dinner, and she ate it, and she went to sleep at a reasonable hour, and was not afraid of anything. 6 months after the boardroom reading, Ada chaired her first full executive meeting in the capacity she had always, technically, held, sole principal of the Bright portfolio, signing authority on all major decisions, the name behind every significant structure that Cornelius had built in a lifetime of careful work. The room was not the glass boardroom at the top of the building. She had chosen a smaller conference room on the 32nd floor, one with a round table, instead of a rectangular one, which she preferred because it made it harder for people to position themselves in opposition. 12 people sat around it, representing the senior leadership of the portfolio's largest operating divisions. She knew all of their names. She had made it a point, in the months since the reading, to know their names and the names of their departments, and what each department did, and what the current problems were, and what the current opportunities were, and who the key relationships were inside and outside the organization. She had not announced any of this research. She had simply conducted it quietly through the methods her father had modeled, reading, asking questions from positions that did not signal the questioner's level of interest, listening to the answers that people gave when they thought they were giving ordinary answers rather than ones that were being evaluated. 3 of the 12 people in the room had met Ada before the reading. Not well, briefly, at events over the years, in the peripheral way that a senior person encounters a colleague's spouse at a company function and does not particularly register them. She remembered each of those encounters more clearly than they did. She remembered, in particular, the one who had directed her at a gala, without any discourtesy, to the table where the non-executive guests were seated. A small thing, a thing he had done automatically, without thinking, because he had seen brain often reaction and acted on it without question. She had gone to the table he indicated. She had spent the evening there. He sat across the round table now and gave her an update on the Eastern Properties acquisition, with the focused attention of someone who has calibrated carefully to a situation and has no desire to be caught wrong-footed. Ada listened. She asked 3 questions, specific, informed questions that demonstrated without commentary that she had read the full file and understood the complications. He answered them carefully and with more detail than he had initially offered, which was the effect she had been looking for. She was not in the business of reminding people of who they had been when they hadn't known what she was. She had decided that early, in the first weeks, when the temptation agreed task was, when she sat across from people who had looked through her for years and felt the pull of wanting them to feel it, to know that she knew, to let the weight of the reversal land fully. She had felt that pull, and she had set it aside, because her father had never once needed people to feel small in order to accomplish things, and she had no interest in being the first person in the bright line to start. What she did instead was simply work. She was good at it. Better, it turned out, than she had expected. The skills she had spent her adult life applying in invisible ways, the capacity for sustained attention, the patience with complicated systems, the memory for detail, the ability to stay composed when the information was difficult, these transferred directly to the work of running a large enterprise, more directly than any formal credential might have predicted. The meeting ran for 2.5 hours. When it was over, and the room had emptied, her assistant came in with a message that someone was waiting in the lobby, a woman who didn't have an appointment but had come in person, which usually meant either extraordinary urgency or extraordinary nerve or both. The name on the message was Eleanor. Ada sat with the message for a moment. Then she told her assistant to have her brought up. Eleanor looked reduced in a way that was different from Gavin's reduction. Gavin had lost bulk, volume, confidence, the physical certainty of someone who believes themselves to be moving through the world correctly. Eleanor had lost precision. She had always been a woman of precise choices, the right shoe, the correct hemline, the calibrated sigh delivered with optimal timing. That precision was still present in some ways, but the intention behind it had gone uneven. She sat down in the chair Ada indicated and arranged herself carefully, and then seemed to realize she didn't know what arrangement she had come for. "I wanted to say something to you," Eleanor said. Then she stopped. Then, "I'm not sure what I wanted to say, actually. I came here without fully deciding," Ada said. "All right, I was unkind to you. Over many years, I was unkind in systematic ways that I understood were unkind while I was doing them, and that I justified through my son's needs and through my own ideas about what families were supposed to look like. Eleanor looked at her hands, and Cornelius, your father, managed things in ways I didn't know about. Ways that meant I was living more comfortably than I would have been otherwise, for years. While telling my son he had married beneath himself, Ada waited. I don't know what I'm asking for, Eleanor said. I don't know if I'm asking for anything. I think I'm just telling you that I know what happened, that I know the shape of it now. Ada looked at her mother-in-law, her former mother-in-law, a correction she had to make consciously. She looked at this woman who had whispered against her for years in the house of a man who had been quietly covering in that same woman's financial gaps, without acknowledgement because his daughter had asked him to let the marriage have a chance. I know you know, Ada said. That's enough. Eleanor looked at her with an expression that was possibly gratitude, and possibly something that didn't have a clean name. She said, You have his quality. Your father's. He used to do exactly this, just say the thing and let it be sufficient. Without, she stopped. I never appreciated it in him either. She stood to leave. At the door, she paused once, the way people in this story kept doing at doors, and Ada thought briefly that perhaps all significant conversations end at doors, that there is something about the threshold that draws out the last honest thing. I'm sorry, Eleanor said, simply, without decoration. I know, Ada said. Eleanor left. Ada sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes afterward. Then she went back to work. The anniversary of Cornelius's death fell on a Wednesday. Ada did not plan anything specific for it. She had learned, over the months, that the grief moved on its own schedule, and that attempting to organize around it produced less useful results than simply allowing it to arrive when it arrived, and working with whatever capacity remained. She worked through the morning. She had a lunch meeting with 2 architects reviewing plans for a community library that one of the Bright Foundations was funding in the neighborhood where Cornelius had grown up, a neighborhood that still contained, on a quiet residential block, the house where Ada had learned to count 4 piles of money on a kitchen table. The house was no longer in the family. It had been sold long before Cornelius's success reached the scale that would have made it possible to simply keep it. But the neighborhood was still there, still itself, and he had given money to it in careful ways over the years, without announcing that he was doing so. The library was her idea. She had proposed it to the foundation board 3 months in, and they had approved it without difficulty, and the architects were good, and the design was right, not grand, not a monument, just a useful and well-made place for people to come and be still and read. Her father would not have wanted a building with his name on it. She intended to call it something else. She hadn't decided yet, but she was thinking about the word tomorrow. After the meeting, she took the elevator down and walked out into the afternoon. She had fallen into the habit, over the past year, of walking in the city without a destination. Her father had done this. She had seen him do it countless times throughout her life, a man moving through a place he had helped build, unrecognized, unhurried, watching things. She had thought, growing up, that it was something he did to relax. She understood, now that it was something else, that the walking was the work, or part of it the particular kind of attention that comes when the body is in motion and the mind is free to receive. She walked for an hour. She moved through streets that her company owned buildings on without thinking about which buildings they were. She passed the restaurant where Gavin had taken Simone the night she had found the biometric evidence of the affair in the documents Whitfield had prepared. She walked past it, the way you walk past something that used to mean something, and has since been reclassified into neutral territory. She thought about Whitfield, who had retired from active practice shortly after the estate had been fully transferred, and who had written her a brief formal note in his measured handwriting, saying that he had always trusted she would be equal to everything Cornelius had prepared her for, and that he was glad to have been a part of it. She had written back in the same register and meant it the same way. She thought about the brass key. She had been wearing it every day since the boardroom meeting, openly, the way she had worn it in the church and in the car, and through every significant day of the year since. People in the office had stopped registering it. It had become simply part of what she looked like. The way a particular kind of watch becomes simply part of what a person looks like, unremarked upon, expected. She thought about what it had meant to carry it for 25 years without knowing what it opened. There was a version of the story in which that was simply a thing that had happened, a father who was cautious, a daughter who was obedient, a key that turned out to be literal. But she had been thinking, over the months, about the other interpretation, the one that felt truer to what she knew of her father, that the key had not merely been a key to a safe, that the keeping of it, the daily act of carrying something important and secret and to the body for years, had itself been the lesson. That patience was not a quality she had been born with, but a practice she had been quietly trained in, and that the training had been the gift. Some doors, he had told her, only open when you're ready for what's behind them. She had not been ready at 20, when she had mad Gavin and believed the version of herself he offered back to her, smaller than she was, but simpler, easier to hold. She had not been ready at 30, when she might have left but hadn't, because she was still in the process of learning what she was actually made of and couldn't yet see clearly enough to understand that her gentleness was not a liability. She had not been ready at 35, when the marriage was already dying, but she was still conducting it on the assumption that patience and steadiness could repair what had been broken long before. She had been ready at the moment she stood in the dark hallway and heard the plan and felt the last of the old softness go still inside her. She turned a corner and found herself on the street that ran beside the park where her father used to walk on Sunday mornings, a long tree-lined path through the middle of the park that he had favored because it had benches at intervals, and he liked to sit and watch the morning conduct itself. She walked the path the way she always had when she came here, which was all the way to the end, to the stone bench near the fountain, where he had once sat with her on a Sunday afternoon when she was 9, and told her, for reasons she hadn't understood, that the most important thing in the world was to be honest about what you actually were, and not what you were afraid people wanted. She sat on the bench. The fountain ran quietly beside her. The park was doing what parks do in early autumn, the trees thinning, the light coming through at new angles, the air carrying the particular dry sweetness of leaves beginning their change. It was a beautiful day in the ordinary way of days that are beautiful without being spectacular. She sat there for a while and let herself be where she was, in this city, in this life, in the particular shape that things had taken. She thought, "You gave me a key and told me to keep it close and keep it quiet and wait until I was ready. And I carried it for 25 years, and when I was finally ready, it opened everything you said it would." She thought, "I don't know if you were right to do it the way you did. I don't know if the years of not knowing cost more than they were worth. But I know that the person who stood in that boardroom and did not raise her voice and did not need anyone to confirm for her what she was, I know that person was built in those years, not despite the difficulty. Inside it, she stayed until the light changed. Then she stood and walked back through the park and out into the city and home. The next morning, she would go to the cemetery. She had been planning it for weeks, without quite articulating the plan to Artis herself. The way certain intentions form below the level of conscious decision and announce themselves only when they are ready to be carried out. She knew what she would bring with her. She knew what she intended to leave behind. The grass had grown in green and full over the place where her father rested. The headstone was simple, plain grey stone, exactly the way he had asked for it, carrying only his name, the years of his life, and the single line he had chosen for himself long before the end. A quiet man builds the loudest legacy. Ada came alone, the way she came most mornings when she came here. No driver, no schedule, just a daughter visiting a father, on a morning that was clear and still and cool the way autumn mornings are when they decide to be gentle about themselves. She stood for a while without speaking. That had become her custom here, the standing first, giving the precise time to around her, giving herself time to run to her eye fully, rather than showing up in body, while the mind was still somewhere else. Her father had always been present when he was present. It was one of the things she had most admired about him and most tried to learn. The cemetery was quiet. A groundskeeper moved slowly along a distant path with a cart. Somewhere in the trees, a bird made a sound and then stopped. The city hummed its constant low note in the distance, indifferent and continuous, the sound of a thing too large to pause. She reached up and lifted the brass key from around her neck. She held it in her open palm and looked at it. The same worn leather cord. The same scratched brass face, warmer now than it had been the day he pressed it into her 12-year-old hands, or perhaps she only thought so because of how many years of her own warmth it had absorbed. 25 years against her skin. Through school and loss and a wedding and a slow, terrible marriage and a dark hallway and a hospital room and a boardroom and a year of learning what she was. It had done what it was made to do. She crouched down slowly beside the headstone. She laid the key gently on top of the cool grey stone. She rested her own hand over it, the way her father used to rest his big warm hand over her small one at the kitchen table, when she was afraid of something and too young to say what. "I was ready," she said quietly. Not loudly. This was not a speech, not a performance. It was simply what she would have said to him if he were here, on a bench in the park, in the low light of a hospital room, at a kitchen table on a Sunday night. The words that were true. "You were right about all of it." She paused. "About the key, about waiting, about not making a sound, about everything you didn't say out loud, because you trusted me to figure it out." The wind moved through the trees at the edge of the cemetery. She could feel it on her face, cool and soft, the kind of wind that carries the smell of leaves and distance. She closed her eyes. She thought about the 4 piles of money on the Sunday table, about the way he had always saved tomorrow's pile for last, about the woman she had been when she wore a brass key hidden under her clothes because her father had told her to, without understanding why. About the woman she was now, standing in good shoes on firm ground, with a clear view of the distances and a company to run, and a year of honest work behind her and more ahead. She thought, "The greatest thing you gave me was not the empire." You knew that. You knew that when you sat at a kitchen table with a small pile of money and called it tomorrow. The money was a tool, the patience was the inheritance. The knowledge that the strongest person in any room is usually the quietest. That was the fortune. She opened her eyes. The key lay on the headstone. The morning light moved across it. She stood. She straightened. The brass key stayed where it was, given back finally to the man who had given it to her, now that its work was done and she no longer needed to be reminded of what she was capable of. She already knew. She had one more thing to say. She said it in the ordinary tone she had always used with him, the tone you use with someone you trust enough not to perform for. "I'm going to run it the way you ran it," she said, steady voice, careful heart.
Long memory for kindness.
The wind came again. She lifted her face toward it. Peace, not the absence of difficulty. There would be more difficulty. She was not naive about the distances still ahead. But the other kind, the deep water stillness beneath the surface, the kind that stays present, regardless of what the weather above is doing. The kind her father had always carried, so quietly that you had to look for it to see it. The kind no amount of money could buy, and no betrayal could take away. She stood for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back through the cemetery, along the path between the stones, toward the gate, and the street and the city and the morning. She did not look back. Some stories end in fire and noise. This one ended the way her father ended everything that ever truly mattered, in quiet, complete, the way a door closes, when it is finally fully ready to close. If this story stayed with you, leave one word in the comments. Just one. Dignity, because sometimes the people who say the least are holding the most, and sometimes the ones everyone underestimated were never without power. They were only waiting for the right door.